This is the Tank Museum's Type 95 or Hago tank. It's the only Japanese tank we actually have in our collection here at Bovington. Japan doesn't have tanks in the First World War. Right at the end of the First World War, it orders a Mark IV tank and it orders 6 Whippet tanks from Britain just after the end of the First World War. Japan's a country that's been modernising its army for a number of years. Back in the turn of the century, it's fought against the Russians, and the Japanese continue into the first decades of the 20th century, building up their military and in many ways westernising it with Western technology. Now, they experiment with these early tanks. They like the idea of the tanks in Japan, but there's an argument goes on in the 1920s. There's a General Suzuki. He argues that tanks should be built in Japan, not imported, so they could build up their tank building strength, their industry, their technical knowledge. They do buy a couple of British 6-tonner tanks, and in 1927, one of those is on trial and it actually catches fire. And it's said that that's one of the reasons the Japanese go down the route with engine power of getting diesel engines in their tank as opposed to petrol, because of this experience of seeing the crew burn or get burnt inside the Vickers 6-tonner. Now, they decide to start their own tank program. They do a number of different model tanks. Some look very much like the imported vehicles they've taken from Europe. They import some Renault FT tanks. They like the idea of, again, this idea of the light infantry tank. They like the idea of having something along the lines of a Carden-Loyd tankette. And they also go for a heavier tank as well. In 1933, they start the program for this Type 95, and a designer called Tamio Hara, he's actually the guy that they asked to really come together. He's already designed this bell crank system of suspension. We'll look at that in a moment. But he's the main instigator behind the Type 95. And what we end up with is, for the Japanese category, it's a light tank. It comes in about 7.5 tons. It's got a 37mm gun, and they're envisaging this tank as a really for infantry support. It's to go into action with infantry as a bolster really to the ground troops. The 37mm gun, it's not considered that effective. It can go through at about 900 feet, something like 1.25 inches of armour plate. It will fire armour piercing and high explosive. They also issue the tank with 2 machine guns as its armament. Starts off with a 6.5mm machine gun, something called a Type 91. We've actually got our Type 91 here. So this is the 6.5mm Type 91 machine gun. It's basically a variation of the infantry gun that would normally have had on the back here a wooden butt that came out. What they do is they get rid of this, they angle the hand grip for space inside the vehicle. You've actually got a fixture so you can fit on a telescopic sight, and the hopper system that they designed for 30 rounds clips onto the side. So this round as well, when it was sometimes used on Japanese tanks, they'd have an armoured cover over the front of it, which why sometimes it almost looked like those flamethrower covers. But again, air-cooled, hence all the ridging down the side there. These were later replaced by a 7.7mm machine gun because they thought they ought to have heavier machine guns inside their tanks. We haven't got that gun fitted because one of the other design elements of this tank was inside. They line the tank with asbestos for 2 purposes. One, they realise if it's going to be fighting in hot climates, sun beating down on the metalwork, it will heat up the interior. The asbestos is to cool that interior. Second point, they give it a little gap. It acts as a bit of a cushion as well to the crew inside as they're being knocked around driving over. Now, unfortunately, that asbestos breaks down those sheets over the years. We have sealed this tank until we get that asbestos removed. We're not going to go inside it, so we won't show you any interior shots unless they're taken from some years ago. So the armament, 2 of those machine guns are fitted. The one is on the back at the turret at what they call a 5 o'clock position. It's facing rearwards, and there's a bit of an issue there because this is really a one-man turret. You've only got the commander in there. So there is no way he could actually be firing the main armament or commanding at the same time, turning round and then firing the machine gun in the back. So sometimes they would turn the whole turret round if they're only wanting to use their machine guns on the enemy positions rather than the 37mm gun. Armour plate, 6mm, 12mm maximum on the front, so relatively thin again. But again, in the mid-1930s, perfectly acceptable as a tank, and especially for where you think the Japanese are thinking of using these vehicles, which is mainly in support of their armies in the Sino-Japanese War. They're on the Chinese mainland. That's where the fighting is going to be going on, and the Chinese have very few tanks there. Some imported Cardinal Lloyd carriers, Panzer I, Panzer II, some things like that, but nothing of much scale to fight against it. Now back to this suspension system. This is what they call a bell crank system. You can see these paired bogie wheels. They started off by having them separated. Now they're actually joined by this tube that runs along there is actually where the spring is. So the idea being when it gets pushed up at one end, that spring is compressed. Again, it's a lateral spring as opposed to a horizontal spring that you'll see on some vehicles. Tracks. Not particularly wide tracks again, but it's a relatively light tank. So mobility is not too bad about getting around on this. Relatively fast for a tank of its period. And again, all round, quite often people compare the technology in this tank with perhaps a slightly later American Stuart tank. They're fairly comparable and probably in many ways designed for some fairly similar ideas behind them, the philosophies, how they're going to be used. Inside the crew of three, we've said the commander's in the turret. He's going to be overloaded. It's very, very tight space. He has no turret basket. He's stepping over the transmission every time he has to move around at all in there. There's a bow machine gunner and there's a driver's position at the front. There's actually a speaking tube from the turret to the driver's position. And there's actually on the rear, there's a small button is put on so that infantry, who, because again, they'll be cooperating, can press that button and it actually lets the driver know that there's actually a message coming through, that we need to actually talk to the infantry behind us. So these are all parts of that design process, how it's going to be used. It is adapted, obviously, in service. Japanese are fairly strict with their tanks. They don't allow the infantry to add things to them that aren't officially sanctioned. Now, you will see on some of them, they actually put some wooden decking over the rear to help carry. It's almost a seating position, so the infantry can be carried into battle on the back of it. But what you don't often see is things like extra armour or track links welded on the front or draped over the front for extra protection. That was frowned upon. But this one vehicle, even though I was saying that they didn't really want to change the vehicle by adding pieces, this bin we have welded on the back is actually an addition. So that's some sort of crew fit has been put there, and that's a little bit of an anomaly because, as I say, on the whole, most of these Type 95s, they look very, very similar when they're in service. What's interesting about this particular tank, we think it was captured later on in Burma. It was taken to India. We have a big report on this tank in our archive and library, an intelligence report, taking it all apart, explaining about what they like about it, what they think is impressive. For example, the quality of the engineering, the bearings in it, they think are really rather good. And what they also see is its vulnerabilities. Simple things which you can imagine in a time of war, they're trying to think of ways that we can defeat this vehicle. And one of the ideas there that they've got in one of the earlier reports is just with this turret, when it turns, there's an overhang. If you're in a position, and think of jungle warfare or think of roads going through jungles where you may be able to approach the tank quite closely, there's actually the suggestion you get a bayonet or a knife and wedge it under the turret as it's turned, so it actually gets stuck there because there's a vulnerability there that they can see. And again, some of these intelligence reports, obviously there's a real onus at the time of getting information about the capabilities of that tank and its weaknesses. One other thing about this vehicle, which is also an issue we have sometimes with other vehicles in the collection, this camouflage that's on here, though it looks old, which gives it an air of authenticity, is actually completely wrong. This is not the camouflage scheme that this vehicle was in when it was captured. And I mention that because that terrible tendency will tell us more about this. This is spurious. So overall, it fits into the light tank category. The Japanese, famously, they use their tanks in China, but because of the nature of the campaigns they're fighting, they don't tend to use tanks in the equivalent Western European battles in large numbers. They tend to be spread around the island hopping campaigns, Burma, etc. Very little in the way of large tank groupings together. Perhaps the only time we can see some serious numbers of tanks is in July of 1939 at the Battle of Kholkhin Gol, where the Japanese have some of their Type 95s there. There's a border incident for the Russians. Stalin sends down Zhukov. The Russians give the Japanese forces there a really bloody nose, and it really is a note of caution to Japan, which is why Japan then doesn't actually attack Russia, even though they've got the pact with Hitler. They don't attack the Russians later in the war when Hitler's pact with Stalin falls apart. There's a kind of border truce, and it only kicks off again in 1945 when Stalin sends his armies into Manchuria and coming south into China. So that's our Type 95, the only Japanese tank, as I said, we have here. Bit of a rarity. One day we'll be able to get back inside. We may be able to, when we clear out that asbestos, we can have a closer look at things like this amazing Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine, 6-cylinder engine in the back that powered it. They make about 2,200, 2,300 of these. They're making them from 33 till pretty much the end of the war. In Japan, they're coming up with better designs about midway through the war. They tended to have made them only in small numbers. They kept them back in Japan, so we don't see so much of those. They were waiting for the invasions. That's where they thought they'd be used. Japanese industrial energy, military might goes into making aeroplanes and ships for the Navy, because that's the nature of the warfare they seem to be fighting most, and it seems logical. Tanks are only a small part of their armour in World War II.